Good morning. This is the Charlotte Talks Weekly News Roundup on WFAE. I'm David Boraks, sitting in for Mike Collins. Well, no shortage of news again this week. I hope we can get to it all with our panel here. We have a big merger of two Southeast banks, BB&T and SunTrust, and it has a side benefit for Charlotte. The city gets the headquarters of the combined company. The Charlotte City Council again discusses the unexpected shortfall in funding for the Cross-Charlotte Trail. City staff has some creative new ideas for finishing the project, but not quite the way it was envisioned. Also at the council, the idea of 4-year terms is a step closer to a voter referendum. Cooper has joined those in calling on Virginia's governor to resign over a racist yearbook photo. Our panel of local reporters is here to talk about those stories and more. With us today are WFAE reporter Steve Harrison. Good morning, Steve.
Good morning.
Mary C. Curtis, columnist for Roll Call on WCCB TV.
Good morning.
Ann Doss Helms is here from the Charlotte Observer. She's the education reporter there. Greetings, Ann.
Good to be here.
And Glenn Burkins, founder and publisher of QCityMetro.com. Here we go again.
Good morning.
So let's start out with that big bank merger. Some of us were busy yesterday chasing that story, and we haven't seen a big merger like this in a while in Charlotte. It didn't involve any of the local banks, but Charlotte could end up being a winner if it goes through. BB&T of Winston-Salem is paying $66 billion in stock for SunTrust of Atlanta. It would create the nation's 6th largest bank. The two companies are calling it a merger of equals, and the two CEOs have taken great pains to make sure it's seen that way. You know, this took me back to 15, 20 years ago when waking up to big bank mergers seemed like a regular thing here in Charlotte. This one was a bit of a surprise. Charlotte hasn't seen a big bank merger since Wells Fargo snapped up Wachovia at the peak of the financial crisis in 2008. But this one feels different to me. It's a merger between two apparently healthy banks that seem to be doing just fine, growing on their own. Here's Kelly King, the CEO of BB&T, Thursday on CNBC after the announcement.
As we talked over the last few weeks, we recognized that we had two great companies that were doing fine, but working together we could do even better.
Steve, let me start with you. What's significant about this merger?
The main headline is that Charlotte will get the headquarters. There's a lot of numbers to kind of deal with. I think BB&T was about the 16th largest bank. SunTrust was the 17th, and so they're going to combine and create the 6th largest. BB&T will have, I think, own about 57% of the new company, a $66 billion bank. And I think that the both CEOs kind of talked again and again how this was a merger of equals. And if that's true, they said they could not put their headquarters in Winston or Atlanta, so they chose Charlotte. Winston, I think, is going to keep community banking. Atlanta will keep corporate and investment banking, but Charlotte will get the headquarters and a lot of high-paying jobs. And I think so people here are celebrating. It's kind of like the old days of bank mergers, but, down the road, the Winston-Salem mayor held a gloomy press conference, and he kind of came out and said he's disappointed. They're losing a big corporate player.
Mm-hmm. Well, this deal came together only in the past few weeks, according to the CEOs. And Bill Rogers, the CEO of SunTrust, said the two companies put everything on the table as they negotiated, including the headquarters location, which you're talking about, and the name, which means ditching their own names. Any thoughts on why they would do that?
I think it goes back again. They kind of kept saying this merger of equals. So if we're going to be equals in it, we can't pick one name or the other. You see that when airlines merge sometimes. They will kind of the dominant player will keep their name and the old airline will go away. Of course, that means just kind of on a quirky way, that means some changes in Uptown to probably our ballpark. BB&T has their name over a lot of stadiums all over North Carolina. And probably as well, we all like to see our skyline grow. I think there's a lot of speculation they will build a new tower.
Right, I was going to ask you about that. It looks like the headquarters is coming to Charlotte, plus this innovation hub that they're talking about. What do we know about this headquarters? They both already have offices here, but is that going to be enough space?
I think that what I've read is that there's a sense that there probably isn't enough space in existing Uptown office buildings, so they need to build. They would probably need to build something on their own. And I think kind of as another interesting fact, this will help Charlotte solidify their bragging rights of we're number 2, right? It's the second biggest banking center. We've been competing or going back and forth with San Francisco over that, so this may let us raise our two fingers proudly for a long time.
Well, we had a slew of economic development announcements in December, and millions and millions of dollars of incentives were thrown around. This one looks like it landed in our laps without any kind of prodding.
Yeah, I don't think there was any closed-door meetings about this where the city and county and the state offered them a big ton of money to come. I think everyone was surprised. So they are just coming on their own.
If only they all came that way. Well, big picture here, Ann, what does this mean for Charlotte to get another bank headquarters?
Well, as Steve mentioned, it's certainly part of our identity, and we were talking before the show, we've all been in Charlotte long enough to know how much the banks are part of the identity. I finally just got to where I could say Wells Fargo instead of Wachovia. The genealogy is so complex, so this will be a new player on the scene. I think what everybody who is in the industry wonders is, is this a plus for me or a minus? And there are always winners and losers. They have said Charlotte employment will grow. They've also said there will be, in that wonderful corporate speak, consolidations across the entire footprint. So, I think if you are working in a BB&T branch and you can look down the street and see a SunTrust branch, you're probably, might reasonably suspect that some of those jobs are going to disappear. But it certainly overall should be a plus for the Charlotte
economy. They actually
economy.
told us that 740 SunTrust and BB&T branches are within 2 miles of each other, which is unprecedented in a merger like this. These two banks their networks overlap so much. Glenn?
Getting a new headquarters is always a great thing. New jobs, supposedly high-paying jobs. I guess the only thing that I would point out is that this city has been trying to diversify its economy for a long time. Banking can be very cyclical, and when the economy goes south, banking can take a hit, as we saw during the last recession, as you pointed out earlier, when Wachovia was snapped up by
Wells Fargo.
Yeah. Right, by Wells Fargo. I think the healthcare sector has been really growing fast. I like the idea of having a more diverse economy. While it feels like the old days, as you point out, the big bank mergers and Charlotte benefits, and I'm happy we got it. I want us to keep working to keep our economy diversified.
Mary Curtis.
Yeah, and also we've seen with a lot of the news that came out with Wells Fargo, which has been in a lot of trouble, that it's good to have actually some good banking news coming out, but also that banks can have their problems as well. So as Glenn has said, I want to reiterate that it's great news, but let's see what happens.
And there are skeptics as well. Bartlett Naylor with Public Citizen, a consumer advocacy group, has really waved some flags about this, saying, and this surprised me, they say 4 U.S. banks already control nearly half of all American checking accounts. So he's very wary of another big bank. He said the last thing the nation needs is another bank that's too big to fail. He's talking about employees getting pink slips and potentially raising rates and fees as the entity gets bigger and has more power. Sometimes that's not a plus for the consumers.
Well, if it was too big to fail when there were many more banks, now they're really big. Yeah.
Just to put it in perspective, this new bank will have $460 million of $1 billion of assets. That's still only a quarter the size of Bank of America, and Wells Fargo. I think it may still be too big to fail. We don't know.
Or it may be small enough to fail.
Small enough to fail.
Which is not something you'd want in your slogan.
No.
Remember what happened to Wachovia? I mean, it was fail or get bought up.
Yeah.
Anyway. Well, we'll keep an eye on that merger. It's supposed to close maybe by the end of the year, possibly in September on the birthday of Kelly King from BB&T. That's what he would like to do. Let's turn our attention now to the City Council meeting on Monday. The City Council again talked about how to pay for finishing construction on the Cross Charlotte Trail. That's a 26-mile trail that's some days supposed to run from Pineville through uptown Charlotte to UNC Charlotte, and voters already approved $38 million in bonds for this project. The money was supposed to pay for it, but City Manager Marcus Jones told the council a couple weeks ago that the city actually needs another $77 million to pay for it. He says work done under previous managers didn't do enough of the design to come up with an accurate cost, so here we are coming up short. On Monday, the manager presented an updated plan, but Steve, you've reported that it looks a lot like the old one. What's the new plan?
Well, yeah, it is. It's very similar to what they proposed in January that so many people were upset about, both on the council and just people in the city. After that, back in January, the manager told me, he said, look, I'm going to finish it as it was originally envisioned. We're going to look at all pots of money. We're going to be creative. And then the plan they presented this week was a few changes, but no new money. They are going to, in kind of the northeast part of the city, they'll kind of patch things together. They're going to build this bicycle boulevard through Noda and Hidden Valley, which will, have a lot of like paint on the road and signs. And so, you'll go from this trail where you have your own path, and they'll put you on the street. And that raises a lot of equity issues among some council members and people in the community.
When is a greenway not a greenway? When it's a street with some lines on it. I think that's the issue that we're dealing with right here.
I think they need to really think hard about that. This is an equity issue, but it's also a health issue. In cities all across the country, African American communities simply do not have the amenities, the parks, the trails, the things like that communities need for residents to stay healthy. And all across the country, cities are trying to address that issue by putting more walking facilities, more parks, more facilities where residents can get exercise. So it's an equity issue, but it's a health issue as well. And I hope City Council will think twice about that plan and how they allocate the resources between South Charlotte, where they're talking about adding more miles, and some of the traditionally African American communities where they're saying, well, we'll put up signs and maybe route people along existing roadway.
Well, to your point there, Councilmember Dimple Ajmera wasn't happy with the manager's suggestions, and she said the city has an obligation to build the northern segment of the trail, not just through the wealthier white neighborhoods in the south.
We are building this because it's easier rather than what was promised. And I think we got to look at alternatives on what was promised and how we can deliver on that promise from the equity perspective.
You can't talk about economic mobility without talking about health. And when it comes to parks and trails and bikeways and things like that, those are vital to residents' health. So if this city is really serious about economic mobility, it needs to get serious about providing these types of facilities.
And I was struck by that when I was reading this, that yes, there are these completely rational reasons that have nothing to do with race or economic class. The southern section is where the most work is already done. It makes economic sense. But if you look back over history, there are always reasons like that, why one side of town gets more than the other side of town. And it's never about race and class. And yet, that's always how it turns out.
And some of these neighborhoods already have fewer sidewalks and, crosswalks and traffic lights. And we've seen that when it happens with bus stops and things like that. So, yeah, it does seem like these neighborhoods get the short end of the stick for many amenities.
Well, we'll continue talking about this in just a minute. You're listening to the local news roundup on WFAE Charlotte Talks. There's lots more to talk about besides the trail. We need to take a short break. We'll be right back.
Support for Charlotte Talks comes from WFAE members and Theater Charlotte, presenting Ain't Misbehavin', the Fats Waller musical show featuring the music and energy of the golden age of the Cotton Club, now through February 17th. Info at theatercharlotte.org. And Carolina Asthma and Allergy Center, serving the Charlotte area since 1952, with 13 locations, including the center's newest office in Hickory. Breathe, live, thrive. CarolinaAsthma.com. Coming up Monday on Charlotte Talks, a conversation with pioneering LGBT author Armistead Maupin. This North Carolina-raised writer broke new ground with his Tales of the City serials and subsequent books. His latest work, Logical Family, looks at his own journey from growing up closeted in a conservative family to being a chronicler of the LGBT experience in America. Talk with Armistead Maupin Monday at 9 on 90.7 WFAE.
The state of our union might be strong, but the state of Virginia is something else.
I had the shoes, I had a glove, and I used just a little bit of shoe polish to put on my cheeks.
Also, Senator Warren apologizes about claims she made about her past, and fans of the rap star 21 Savage have a lot of questions about his backstory. The Friday News Roundup next time on 1A.
The roundup of the week's news continues at 10 o'clock here on listener-funded 90.7 WFAE.
Welcome back to the Charlotte Talks Local News Roundup on WFAE. We're taking a look at the week's top stories with our panel. Steve Harrison of WFAE, columnist Mary C. Curtis of Roll Call and WCCB, and Doss Helms of the Charlotte Observer, and Glenn Burkins of QCityMetro.com. So I guess one of the questions here about the Cross Charlotte Trail is, will the council really take the lead on this and make something happen that's different from what the manager is proposing? City Council member Larkin Eggleston wanted to make it clear that these new ideas for finishing the trail were only a temporary fix.
I'm completely all right with the bike boulevard as a bridge, figuratively speaking, a bridge solution to the end result, but I don't want anybody to think that we are saying this is what you're getting and then that's going to be it. I mean, it needs to be a Band-Aid solution.
Steve, what happens next with this?
So I think last month the manager said he would look at different kinds of money to fund this, including hospitality taxes. Councilmember Braxton Winston floated the idea of that this trail could be a tourism draw. The manager said he would do that, but then earlier this week there was no talk about that at all. I think the next play will be this summer when they do their budget and they set their property tax rate, because we just had the reval. So there is millions and millions of dollars out there that, if you don't roll your tax rate back to revenue neutral, there's an opportunity, you could call it an opportunity if you want, to get more money and possibly, we'll see. Maybe they might try and get a few more $1 million for the next fiscal year to advance this.
Okay. There is another concern about this topic, which is that this was a project that we thought we had enough money to pay for, and it turns out we didn't. And now the manager is saying there may be another 8 projects or so. Steve, do we know what some of those other projects might be?
I missed the city had a budget workshop on Wednesday, and I didn't cover that one. But I do know that I think there are a handful of projects that he said are maybe a little short, but nothing like the $77 million gap at the Cross Charlotte Trail. That's so big that they can't really work around it. And I don't think they said there's anything else coming up.
Gotcha.
To that degree.
Well, also at Monday's meeting, the topic of 4-year terms came up again. It's something the City Council has been talking about for a while. They want to increase term lengths from the current 2 years to 4. At this point, it seems that most council members support the idea of switching. The question is whether they should approve it themselves, which they could do, or put it to a referendum. Steve, walk us through this here. What's the idea here? What's the rationale, and where are we on it?
So the majority of council feels like a 2-year term is too short, that you spend about a year in your job working, and then in the second year you start thinking about re-election and raising money, and it's a lot of work, and the campaigning is so exhaustive. They'd like to go to 4 years, think they could get more done. There are a lot of cities in North Carolina that have 4-year terms. So this is what they want to do. Now, then how do you go about it? They can put it to a vote, referendum, which would be in November. I think that's what they're going to do. They could do it themselves, but the problem there is that it's very easy for someone to do a petition to force a vote. You only need 5,000 signatures. That's not hard to get.
So there might be a vote eventually. Why not just make
That's
that
right.
the plan? Okay. Where do council members stand on this? Is there a chance they could decide to do it themselves? Or, is there enough support for going it alone?
I think they will put it to the voters. The council's 2 Republicans aren't in favor of the idea at all. But there's still, that leaves 9 who would be open to 4-year terms or who aren't opposed to it. I think the problem with doing it themselves is that they'll also be up for re-election in November. And so I don't think they want that kind of weighing. I think if they've put it to voters, I think it gives them some separation.
We saw a referendum for county commission, and that did not pass. So I think they would have their work cut out for them in terms of selling this to voters. If they put it to the vote, they would have to put forth a very compelling reason, other than the fact that it's just not long enough. Congress is 2 years, the House of Representatives, and you could argue that they're dealing with much more than our local city council in some ways.
It does seem like every time the council brings this up, there are a lot of people out there saying, whoa, wait a minute, don't go so fast. So,
And who's going to, and if they, who is going to be the lead to really sell this? In a way, that would be the mayor's job. That's, that she is that kind of has the bully pulpit, but the mayor hasn't been particularly into this. She hasn't opposed it, but I don't think she's really going to spend much political capital on 4-year terms.
She seemed very reluctant to really jump behind it.
Yeah, you don't want that, as you said, Steve, to be a political issue that an opponent can run on. Yeah.
It does seem, was there not at one point in this a discussion about, they also want to increase the mayor's term to 4 years and maybe staggering that with the council and staggering some of those council terms, Steve?
Which is essentially the model that the Charlotte-Mecklenburg School Board has. And that was created by the state legislature when they consolidated, I believe, or when they shifted to a district representation system. So, yeah, they have, the 3 at-large get a 4-year term, and then 2 years later, the 6 district representatives run for their terms. So you still have an election every 2 years, but any given person is only campaigning every 4 years.
Steve, is this, will we know more about this Monday?
Yeah, I think they do have a vote scheduled. It's weird. There's so many little incremental steps in this process. I think they will vote to officially start the process or start the countdown clock to eventually put it on the ballot, because we'll have a public hearing eventually. I mean, there's a lot of little small steps, but yeah, there's another one coming up on Monday.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's turn to a council member who's making news beyond the council chamber. City Council member Lawana Mayfield was nominated by Governor Roy Cooper for a seat on the State Human Relations Commission. But this week he took it back after an old tweet about the police from last year came back to haunt Mayfield. Republican Senate Leader Phil Berger and other Republicans took issue with tweeted remarks by Mayfield after a police shooting of a black man in California. Even the Charlotte Observer editorial board joined in questioning the appointment. Glenn, how did Mayfield get into the situation? What's the background?
Well, you might remember that a couple years ago, one was last year, she actually posted a tweet comparing police, her critics say, to terrorists. I don't have the exact wording.
I got the words here. Being black in America under President Trump has created homegrown terrorists wearing blue uniforms.
And people jumped all over that to say that she was disparaging police officers. And as you pointed out, Republicans, after Governor Cooper appointed her to this commission, Republicans wrote to him, said, asking him to rethink it. He did, and she's gone.
Is this something that Cooper didn't foresee? Should he have foreseen it?
Well, it's tough to say what someone else should have foreseen. I'm not sure that he gave it a lot of thought, but I don't have any direct knowledge on that.
Was there much said about this tweet at the time? Do we remember?
Yes, there was a lot said about the tweet. Not just that one. There was another one that questioned 9/11. She basically tweeted asking where was the evidence, where was the plane, where was the engine from the plane that crashed into 9/11. In essence, calling into question the official finding that terrorists flew airplanes into the towers, and that's why they imploded. So they both got a lot of attention. So that information was out there for the governor to have if he had decided to look at it.
Well, we weren't able to get Mayfield on tape this week about this, but here's how she defended the tweet last May on Charlotte Talks.
There are officers out there who, by definition of terrorism, who create terror, who are creating fear. The pure definition. There are officers out there who are doing just that.
Have we heard anything from Mayfield since the appointment was rescinded?
I don't think so.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Glenn.
I exchanged a text message with her. She was doing other things and said she would talk with me later. So I'm hoping to hear from her at some point.
And I know she did get into a back and forth with Councilperson Tariq Bakari talking about this, and he was saying you're such a great advocate. These kinds of things, it subverts your message, and she was saying it's a valid message. So, I know she was talking about that.
Yeah, it was interesting going back to those two tweets from, I think that was 2018. or 7. Anyway, I can't. Anyway, the two tweets. The first one was the tweet about 9/11, and that probably got the most attention. And at the time, her colleagues on the council were really. No one wanted to speak about it at all and kind of comment or engage her on that in any way. And then the one about the police surfaced, and like you said, Tariq Bakari they were more critical, and I guess it was just a very local issue that the local police officers had complained, and I guess no one felt like that 9/11 had any kind of local relevancy.
Yeah, I mean, that's the trouble with a tweet. You have no context, and I'm not at all approving of this at all. In saying that, but I am saying that in the context of when she was saying that, she was talking about a police shooting of an unarmed black man, and you bring up the names of Tamir Rice and Philando Castillo, and just recently, Amantic Bradford, the young man who had a permit to carry a weapon and was shot in Alabama, and the police officer has been cleared. He's not going to be charged. And she's saying the folks who elected me in the neighborhood are familiar with police officers who profile. And she did mention the president because under President Trump's Justice Department, they have actually let a lot of police departments who had signed consent decrees to make some changes in the wake of these relationships between police and the communities they cover, and they can withdraw from them. It's happened in Chicago, where, of course, a police officer was just convicted of murdering Laquan McDonald. In Baltimore, my hometown, which has had its own problems. And then, of course, here in Charlotte, we are not immune to these. So I am, like, as I said, not approving of it, but it happens in a context of things that really get lost in a tweet. And so rather than have a discussion about what certain people in certain neighborhoods feel, that they are they are underprotected and over-policed, it comes in charges going back and forth, and she's being pulled off the commission. So as I said, it's political, everything is political, but there are issues underlying it that get totally lost.
Glenn Burkins.
Just to add to what Mary said, there's the substance of what she said, and there's the style. And if you go into many African American communities around the country, you will not get many people who will dispute the substance of what she said. Perhaps she could have said it in a little bit more diplomatic way. As Mary said, tweets kind of lend themselves to short, pithy sayings. But it's unfortunate that the style became that the style of what she said became the focus rather than the substance, because there is some substance to what she to what she pointed out.
And there is a history of people who hold power telling people who don't hold power how they're allowed to speak about their issues. That you can come to the table as long as you don't upset us too much in the way you say that. And again, it's perfectly valid to critique the way LaVonna Mayfield made this point, but it does kind of feel like she made it. The discussion was there. She was appointed to a commission that I'm going to go out on a limb and say is not the most huge, high-profile thing out there. I had to look up to see what the Human Relations Commission is. It's charged with basically advocating and enforcing equality in housing, fair employment practices, education, justice, governmental services. It doesn't really surprise me that Roy Cooper might have said, sure, she's qualified for this. I didn't know who any of the members were. I had to look up. They apparently have 17 of the 22 positions filled. Toussaint Romaine, who is a public defender here who ran for district attorney, probably well known to all of us. I didn't know he was on that commission. So it just kind of seems like one of those things that it was neither a high-profile appointment nor new material.
There was a national LGBTQ organization that issued a statement saying they were very disappointed at Governor Cooper's decision to rescind the appointment, and they characterized Councilwoman Mayfield as a champion of the dispossessed. And I think you could make that argument. Of all the people on council, she's probably the most outspoken when it comes to marginalized communities. And so, as Ann said, I can understand why the governor would have appointed her to that.
And I just want to add a personal note. I think I'm the only person at the table here this morning that is the mother of an African-American man who has been stopped by police for a reason he did not feel was fair. He actually took it to court. And I think if you go in many communities and you walk down the street and ask folks, there'll be some communities will say, oh my gosh, nothing like, the police wouldn't do anything like that. And others where people would say, oh yeah, this happens all the time. So these voices, as Ann said, they need to be heard, and sometimes they will give you the message in a way you might not think is artful. But to silence the voice itself, well, we'll have to see. As we can see for all the stories we had this week, more we'll be getting into the problems of race and justice and history are ones that continue.
Well, we got to ask you, how did that court case come out for your son?
He fought the law, and he won that time.
Excellent.
But he paid for a lawyer. It was more than he would have paid for the fine, but he felt it was justice.
Well, one last question about this. I believe Mayfield is the longest-serving council member. She's represented District 3 in the West Side since 2011. Steve, we got an election coming up. Is she running again?
She has said she's going to run for that large seat. So, like I said, like you said, she's represented District 3 for a long time, and she will run at large. That means that I assume all of the 4 at-large members today will run for re-election.
Not so really an opening, yeah.
That would put five incumbents running for 4 seats.
Is this a good idea for her, you think?
It's hard to tell. I think she's safe for re-election in her district. I definitely would not rule her out.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's shift our focus now from the local to the national. President Trump finally gave his State of the Union address on Tuesday, and we talked about that on the program here Wednesday, but it's worth revisiting. Mary, you wrote about this for Roll Call. What were your takeaways from the president's speech?
Well, I thought that he went into it as all presidents do, particularly since he has, he was defeated in the House. He got a bit of a rebuke when Democrats took over the House, and he talked about unity and working together on issues like infrastructure and prescription drug prices. But this president, before then, he spent time insulting a whole lot of people like Joe Biden and John McCain. And in the speech, it quickly morphed into a little bit of the message that you heard from Richard Nixon before Watergate, when that was coming down, which he did not want progress to be hindered by ridiculous partisan investigations. Democrats took that as a threat, and we've seen this week they've ramped up many investigations. We also saw actually setting up some issues I think will be campaign issues for 2020. I think the strong economy hasn't helped, according to polls, as much as he thought. So you are seeing issues of immigration and abortion, and these divisive cultural issues that you can see will probably be coming up in the 2020 campaign.
Mm-hmm. What does this say about the 2020 campaign? What is this setting this all up? Are we going to see more of the kind of rhetoric from the president?
Well, definitely, particularly on immigration and, as I can say, on abortion. And then we can come back, we can talk a little bit about what Stacey Abrams says about what is going to be the Democrats' message in 2020.
That's Mary C. Curtis. It's time for a break here. We'll be right back with more of the local news roundup on Charlotte Talks on 90.7 WFAE.
Support for Charlotte Talks comes from WFAE members and Willis Towers Watson, dedicated to helping organizations navigate the challenges of a complex and changing world with an integrated approach to risk and human capital management. WillisTowersWatson.com. And Catawba College Salisbury, where 96% of graduates leave college either with a job or with acceptance into graduate school. Catawba College, whose mission is to transform, inspire, and help students belong. Catawba.edu. Coming up at 10 o'clock on 1A, the roundup of the week's news continues with a look around the nation at the top stories of the week, including President Trump's State of the Union address and reaction to it, 3 separate scandals for top officials in Virginia, and much more. The Friday News Roundup with Joshua Johnson and his guest is next at 10 on 1A, here on 90.7 WFAE.
WFAE received more than 370 podcast ideas during our Queen City PodQuest. Which ones will make it to the final round for the chance to win a cash prize and a podcast deal at WFAE. You decide. Vote for your favorite podcast idea once per day until February 17th on WFAE.org/Queen City Podcast.
Welcome back. It's the Charlotte Talks Local News Roundup on WFAE. We're taking a look at the week's top local stories. Just a reminder, our panel this week is Steve Harrison of WFAE, columnist Mary C. Curtis of Roll Call and WCCB, Ann Doss Helms of the Charlotte Observer, and Glenn Burkins of QCityMetro.com. Mary, we were talking just now about the State of the Union address, and you had another angle on this. The Democratic response was given by Stacey Abrams, who was the first African-American woman nominated by a major party to run for a governor. She was in Georgia. She told her own story. It was a bit of a platform for her. What do we hear there?
Well, just the choice of Stacey Abrams was a statement. But the Democratic Party has often been said that they have ignored their major voting base, which is African Americans, particularly African American women, who really vote above their demographic. And so the fact that she was chosen, she's not an elected official. They do want her to run against David Perdue in 2020 in Georgia, because even though she did not win, she brought a lot of voters out, and it did help a lot of down-ballot folks win in Georgia. She brought up issues that Republicans didn't talk about, like climate, and particularly the issue of voting rights, which is something that, she feels that a lot of irregularities went on in Georgia, particularly that her opponent was the Secretary of State who oversaw the vote, his own vote, Brian Kemp, now governor. And so I think that was the message going forward, that you can see that the Democrats are going to lean into. So it was very interesting, the contrast.
Well, to borrow a phrase from you in one of your columns, the State of the Union is always a chance for political theater.
Yes.
And, a lot of times it's a chance for the president and Congress people to bring people into the chamber who represent some kind of an issue or a symbol. And Glenn, you wrote about one of these, the guest of Representative Alma Adams, the Mecklenburg County Democrat. Who did she invite, and what was the message there?
Each member of Congress gets to invite a guest to attend the State of the Union address. She invited a young man who had once been sentenced to federal prison for life plus 5 years for selling crack cocaine. He went into prison well into his term. His sentence was reduced after President Obama signed basically a Fair Sentencing Act or something that reduced the amount of time that inmates would get for selling crack cocaine versus powdered cocaine. But while he was in prison, he started something called SAVE, where he worked with other inmates to teach character, get their lives together. His sentence was reduced. He came out. Now he's doing that here in Charlotte. He's going into 2 schools in CMS basically to do character development. And Congresswoman Adams said she wanted to take him because she wanted to raise attention to the need for further reform in the criminal justice system. Even though we had the First Step Act signed into law earlier this year or late last year, there are still huge inequities in terms of sentencing. And there are people who are sitting in jail or prisons that she feels should be given a second chance. And she felt that this young man was an example of what people can do and what they can become if they are given second chances.
Well, we got a lot more to cover here, and I want to move on to another issue that's been in the news that is race-related here. Governor Cooper and many other Democrats and Republicans have been calling on Virginia's Democratic Governor Ralph Northam to resign. This is because of a racist photo in one of his old yearbook albums that became public. It shows 2 people, one in blackface, one in a Ku Klux Klan hood, standing side by side. Governor Cooper called the photo reprehensible, and he joined many others in asking the governor to step down. So far, Northam has said no. This is a bit unusual. We have a Democrat calling on a Democrat to resign. Glenn, what are your thoughts on this?
Actually, it's not that unusual. I think, and perhaps I'm biased here, but I think Democrats, when you look, I think they've probably asked people to step down recently who was the senator who they asked to step down for?
Well, Senator Al Franken.
Al
He did,
Franken.
yeah, step down. Yeah, they say it's taking the moral high ground because they say Republicans don't do very much. And you had the case of the Iowa Representative Steve King, who was taken off committees, but he was not asked to resign after a string of racist statements and appearances.
Right.
So they're basically trying to set a different standard.
So I guess I would first say that I don't think it is that unusual for Democrats to ask Democrats to step down. But going back to something Mary said earlier, I think the Democratic Party is finally coming to grips and even embracing its diversity. And African Americans are a huge part of the Democratic Party. And I think it had to take a zero tolerance policy in terms of the Virginia governor and those posts.
Well, Mary, go ahead.
Yeah, and also, I mean, it first took some Democrats, but if you look at these yearbooks, as people have been looking at them, it was inevitable, and it did happen that a Republican was ensnared, a Republican legislator in Virginia, who was the head of the VMI, Virginia Military Institute's yearbook, when they had a slew of racist slurs for slurring many races and blackface photos. And this is happening all the time. Even now, every year you have some fraternity, these blackface parties that come up. And I think, particularly it's Black History Month, we say. And I think people say, why do you have a Black History Month? Well, that's, what about a White History Month? Well, that's the rest of the year. We don't do our students and our anybody any good by teaching a history that we don't teach enough about African Americans, Asian Americans, Native Americans, which is why you see, the tomahawk chops and things like that. And I think we don't want to have that difficult conversation about things like this. So when Governor Northam said, I didn't know until recently when I was telling a black friend, and he said this was offensive. Well, he might have been telling the truth, because who gets educated on the history of blackface, of Jim Crow, of why it came to be, of the demeaning stereotypes? So I think this would be a time to basically think and say, maybe we are teaching history wrong, and we're doing our kids and ourselves a disservice.
And I think that's something we've all sort of been asking ourselves, how does this happen? I mean, these are my contemporaries. I was in college in '79. I did not dress up like that, but you think the very best spin you can put on this is that somehow they think this is like dressing up like a cowboy or a caveman or something, that somehow they are so detached from the reality of our history and the reality of life as African Americans that they just thought it was kind of edgy and funny to do this. And that's an ignorance that is really hard to dismiss, and really that we would hope we would not keep.
Someone posted on social media a picture that the poster claimed came from one of North Carolina's major universities. I won't give the name of the school because I've not independently verified that it was in the yearbook, which was even more offensive than, if it's possible, even more offensive than those that were on the Virginia governor's page. This is just something that just keeps coming up and coming up. And I find it hard to imagine or accept the "I didn't know" answer, or "I didn't understand," or "I didn't know that was offensive." This is still happening. It's not something that was relegated decades ago or centuries ago. We're still seeing these posts.
And look at the fights we're having over the Confederate monuments. So there is always this debate over history, and look at the Silent Sam debate in UNC. This is something we have to talk about, and it's really important when it follows to policy. I think it's not just an image, but say the yearbook photo was in a medical school yearbook, and we've seen studies that show black maternal health is incredible. Many times, like a third world country, we see that doctors often don't give black patients as much pain medication because they believe these stereotypes that African Americans can withstand pain more. So it's not harmless because in policies, it can really hurt folks. So we really, as Glenn said, and as Ann has said, we need to do this, or else it will keep happening over and over again.
One of the smartest things that I heard someone say is that unless we really come to grips with this issue, 20 years from now or 30 years from now, we will be arguing that the tiki torch carrying neo-Nazis who marched in Charlottesville, that those were just indiscretions, that they didn't know better. Where does this end? At some point we have to say, as a society, we have to stop and say, enough. If you do these types of things, they're going to come back to haunt you, and you will be held responsible.
And it wasn't as if nobody knew. As my friend and former colleague Pam Kelly pointed out, she was co-editor of the Daily Tar Heel at the time, and her co-editor, Brad Kutro, wrote an editorial in 1980 citing the pictures that have now come to light from the UNC Chapel Hill yearbook, and said, "Those who argue that racism and discrimination on this campus are ebbing have only to look at page 400 of the 1979 Yakety Yak for evidence to the contrary." And this guy, who was a white fraternity boy at that time, wrote an editorial saying, "This is horrible, this is embarrassing, we should not accept this."
And for those who haven't seen it, it shows three people, two in Klan hoods and a third in blackface with a noose around his neck that goes up to a chandelier hanging from the ceiling.
Well, it is part, I think, of coming to terms with this part of our past, and I wonder to what extent that is because of the person in the White House.
Well, a lot of people will say, now we've come to a time where being called a racist is worse than committing racist acts. So, the voters need to decide. That's all I'm saying.
Well, Ann Helms, I want to come back to you with some topics in education this week. There was a story about possible changes in the state's end-of-grade exams. Some love them as a statewide benchmark. Others hate them. What's going on here?
Well, I think it's a little bit confusing. I guess with the end-of-grade exams, they are talking about having fewer questions and making it a little bit shorter. But the tests that they're actually talking about eliminating are, and this is why testing is so crazy, they're North Carolina State final exams. And they test the students, but those results are used primarily to evaluate teacher effectiveness. And this came about as part of Race to the Top, which was one of the many federal iterations of trying to get schools to be accountable for student results. But they're now saying, you know what, that's just not a particularly good use of time.
Mm-hmm. Well, what has to happen for these to be eliminated?
I believe it would take action by the State Board of Education. I don't think it would take legislative action to eliminate those tests.
All right, well, we'll keep an eye on that. An annual report from the State Board of Education says fewer teachers are leaving North Carolina schools, either quitting or taking jobs elsewhere, and Republicans are saying this shows their policies of raising teacher pay and policy changes are working. Ann, where do these findings come from, and what do they show, actually?
Well, this is a survey that the state does every year. It's called the State of the Teaching Profession, and when you leave, you do exit interviews, and they track, and so it's become more refined over the years. They try to see how many people may have just moved to another school within the district, how many are still teaching in North Carolina, how many retired with full benefits, which essentially means that's something that you expect to happen. So what they're really looking at is who's leaving because of policies that we might be able to change. And there are still significant voluntary departures, teachers leaving to go into other careers, and those are primarily happening among the teachers in the first 5 years. So again, the Republicans are saying, look, we have made significant moves to boost salaries, especially those early year salaries, and the fact that we have a pretty good economy, so there are alternatives, because you often see teacher turnover really slow down during recessions because you kind of want to hold on to a good job. So they're saying, look, they could go to better jobs. They're choosing to stay in teaching. Hooray for us. Not surprisingly, teacher advocates are saying, not so fast. We still have a long way to go.
Any numbers here specific to Mecklenburg?
We do. Let me find them in here. Basically, CMS turnover was very similar to the state average, which is actually an improvement for CMS. There was a stretch when CMS was way over state averages. So CMS has about 9,000 teachers. They lost about 7.8% of them overall in the year that they were tallying, or just over 800 teachers. One of the weird little twists of this was that I had not seen before was that they tallied teacher vacancies on the first day and on the 40th day of school. And I don't know what to make of this. On the first day of school, Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools had 47.5 vacancies. Wake County had 1,563. I don't know how you open school. I thought that was a typo, but I double-checked the report. So if it's a typo, it's in the state report. By the 40th day, CMS had 121 vacancies and Wake was down to 103.
Well, I want to get to a couple more things here before we quit. Last week on this program, we talked about Bennett College in Greensboro, a women-only African-American college that was trying to save itself. And there was an update on Friday afternoon about their efforts to raise money. Glenn, what happened?
They needed to raise $5 million to retain its accreditation. They ended up at $8.2 million. There was a $1 million donation from High Point University, and another $1 million donation from a California entrepreneur and philanthropist. And they've not released all of the names of the donors, but they got well over the $5 million that they needed. And
this is part of their efforts to retain their accreditation. They have to go back to the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools here and try and win that back. What's the process, and how likely is it they'll keep it?
There's an appeal later this month, sometime around the 15th, I believe. First of all, the numbers have to be audited by the association, and we'll know a little bit more after that appeals hearing.
Finally, we can't leave without talking about the latest Panthers stadium rumors. This one was started by Panthers owner David Tepper himself. He wants to put a roof on the stadium. Steve, in just about 15 seconds.
So, right, does he really want to do that, or was he just being flippant? I'm not sure. I'm not aware of any outdoor stadium that's been domed after it was built for an outdoor stadium, if that makes any sense. Be very strange.
Well, we'll see if that happens. Thanks to our panelists, Ann Doss Helms of The Observer, Glenn Burkins from Q City Metro, Mary C. Curtis, the columnist for Roll Call and WCCB, and Steve Harrison of WFAE. My name is David Boraks. This has been the Local News Roundup on WFAE.